I was going to go through each of these one by one, but I'm not going to take the time for that now. But I'm just going to point them out. These are the 12 cranial nerves. These are the conduits into and out of, directly into and out of the brain. All right. So the spinal nerves are coming in and out of the central nervous system via the spine, but these are the conduits in and out of the central nervous system directly into the brain. Okay, there's 12 of them, and some of them we're going to get a chance to talk about in a little bit more detail, such as the optic nerve. I'll touch on the, you'll get a little whiff of the olfactory nerve in the lecture in a couple weeks. What other ones? I'll also talk a little bit about the eye movement muscles. The vagus nerve is probably the most important one on this sheet here in terms of actual applicability to some systems that we're going to talk about. The vagus nerve is going to come up when we discuss the autonomic nervous system because it innervates so much of the internal viscera in the body. It interacts with the enteric nervous system and the digestive system, the liver, the spleen, pancreas, the heart, the lungs, the larynx, the pharynx. So a whole bunch of viscera through the body. Vagus itself is related to the word vagrant. Vagus means wanderer. So it's the wandering nerve of the body. We will talk about the vestibular cochlear system. You'll hear some about that. And is there anything else? Oh, there's a lot of things I'd love to say about them, but we're going to pass on that. That's a little bit more anatomy than I think we're ready for today. So then after the cranial nerves are the spinal nerves. Let's look at the spinal cord. So the spinal cord and the spinal nerves are broken up into 4 or 5 regions: the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral, or the and the coccygeal, or those last two sort of going together. So the cervical spinal nerves are so named because they're associated with the cervical vertebra. Cervical vertebra are the vertebra in your neck that do not have ribs attached to them. So everything above the attachment point of the ribs are in the cervicis or neck. And there are spinal nerves that are associated with each of them, with the vertebra that is directly above that spinal nerve. So the spinal cord itself, if you look at the diameter, there is this cervical enlargement. That is because there's more cell bodies in the cervical region. Those cell bodies are there because they are part of innervating the upper extremity, your hands, your arms, your forearms. So that's part of the cervical enlargement there. Taking a look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you're gonna need a little bit of anatomy here, not a whole lot, but just a little bit of anatomy. We see gray matter and white matter. So why is gray matter gray? What did I say? Because it's the cell bodies. And then Anna, why is the white matter white? Is that? Myelin. Myelin. Yep. Great. And so these are going to be tracts or columns in the white matter. So fibers will be ascending or descending in the white matter, and in the gray matter, we're going to have actual cell bodies that are resident in these nuclei. Okay. Then projecting from this gray matter is this dorsal root. So this is the dorsum, and this is posterior, and this is anterior. There is this posterior gray horn, there's a lateral gray horn, and an anterior gray horn. That's what we call these. Emanating from the posterior gray horn is this dorsal root, which expands into this dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies. It's a cluster of neuronal cell bodies, which means that there's going to be some synapses happening in this dorsal root ganglion. I do not want you to get the dorsal root ganglion confused with something that we're going to learn about later that's nearby but out of frame here, called the sympathetic chain ganglia. We will talk about those in due course. This is the dorsal root ganglia. And it's emanating directly from the posterior great horn. It joins up with this ventral root. There's no ganglion here. A ventral root on the anterior side. So this is body cavity down here, outside world behind your spinal vertebra out here. Your back is back here. The two of them join together and form the spinal nerve. All right? So this is how spinal nerve emanates. And there's some other features which aren't as important. The central canal here is contiguous with the ventricles of the brain. Remember I showed those hollow spaces in the brain at the end of last class, which are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. It is contiguous with this central canal that runs down the center of the spinal cord. All right. So these spinal nerves in the cervicis, these cervical spinal nerves, they come together and they will merge and branch and merge again into what's called a plexus. A plexus is simply a network of nerves. Say we have 4 nerves here. They're going to come together and come apart and come together. So this would be a plexus. So a fiber that starts here can travel like that, or it could travel out this way. One that's over here can travel out this one, or out that one. So it's a blending of the fibers that originate in the different spinal segments, and those fibers blend till they get to the terminal destination in the body. Right here, this is the cervical plexus. An extremely important branch of the cervical plexus is this one here. It's called the phrenic nerve. And we see it coming off of C4, C5, a little bit of C3, C3, 4, 5 fibers, descending down through the rib cage, the thoracic cavity. Does anyone want to guess what that phrenic nerve does? Who's good at reading? It innervates the diaphragm. All right. So if you have an interruption if you have a spinal injury above C3, it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous because not only are you going to be paraplegic and not be able to dance around anymore, but you may not be able to breathe. Okay? Phrenic nerve, an important one, because if that one gets interrupted, you need to get that person on artificial ventilation quickly. All right. So below the cervical plexus is the brachial plexus. And this is in the lower branches of the cervical region and some of the top spinal branches of the thoracic region. We form the brachial plexus. And here's a nice depiction of how this works, right? So we have roots, trunks, divisions, and cords, and then cords go into branches. The way, and those are the different segments of the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is bringing sensory information from the upper extremity and bringing efferent motor innervation to the muscles of the upper extremity. The way to remember those, I'm not going to test you on this, but for those of you who go to medical school, maybe it'll help. Robert Taylor, who I don't know who that is, but Robert Taylor drinks cold beer. is how you remember roots, trunks, divisions, roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches. Robert Taylor drinks cold beer, so maybe that'll help you someday, I hope. All right, moving down into the thoracic spinal nerves. We have the 12 spinal nerves, only 10 of them are depicted here. The thoracic vertebra, they're each is associated with the thoracic vertebra. Thoracic vertebra is characterized by having an attachment to the ribs. So there's a rib attached to it. There is also, so there's a transverse foramen on the cervical vertebra that the thoracic vertebra do not have. That's just anatomical minutia. That's not important here. But thoracic spinal nerves mostly serving the body wall. And also fibers that are coming off of the cervical vertebra go to what is called the sympathetic chain ganglia. We will talk about the sympathetic chain ganglia during our autonomics chapter, which is in another lecture or two. Next lecture is about neurotransmitters, and then after neurotransmitters, I'm going to move into autonomics. So here, I want you to notice as we're moving down. Here we see there's quite a bit of gray matter. And a significant amount of white, an enlargement in the cervical region. As we move down in the thoracic region, much less gray matter, and that's because there's not nearly as many cell bodies there. It's not the body wall doesn't have as many muscles, doesn't have as much that needs control as the upper extremity. Then, as we move into the lumbar region, we see that gray matter expands once again. And this is going to be because of what? What do you think, Logan? Use those keen powers of deduction. Want to guess?
Controlling your lower body?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the analog to the upper extremity here in the lower extremity. In the upper extremity, we had the brachial plexus. What do you expect that we're going to have down here, Jacob Laser? Give it to me.
So, I'm trying to remember the Latin or whatever word for leg. But,
Good thought. But actually, it doesn't follow that same naming convention as you would have logically expected it to.
There's no plexus for your legs.
But there is, and it's named after the region of the back that it comes off of. It's called the lumbar plexus. There are 5 lumbar spinal nerves here. We see the last 2 of the thoracic depicted here. And there is, indeed, a lumbar enlargement. Now, what's interesting about the spinal cord is it ends actually at about L1. It ends at L1 in this conus medullaris. And then descending from that, what's in the spinal column at this point is what's called the cauda equina. The cauda equina. What does that mean? Yannick, you seem to be a master of languages. Give me a guess. What do you think cauda equina means?
Equina is horse.
Good. Cauda, what do you think? Tail. Yeah, it's the horse's tail. Good job, both of you. Yeah, the cauda equina. And it is truly like a horse's tail. It has all of these spinal nerves that are bundled together within the spinal column until they emerge through the spinal segments at the different lumbar segments from which they're supposed to emerge, or the sacral segments. All right, and so then the very bottom here, there's going to be 5 sacral, and then finally a single coccygeal nerve. As a person gets older, when you're young, the sacrum is actually a series of 5 bones, as is the coccyx. And then as you ossify and get to be a crusty bugger like me, they begin to fuse with one another. And become a single bone. All right. So I guess I didn't show a picture of the lumbar plexus, did I? Well, here's the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is, as you would guess, a combination of the different branches of the sacral nerves. There are some lower lumbar nerves that jump into it. And what's interesting here is that they blend together and form this massive nerve called the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve. And many of you have probably heard of this nerve before. People get sciatica, particularly people here in the West who spend so much time sitting on their back ends. And this sciatica is basically a spasm of the piriformis muscle, which has been contracted so much, but is never stretched because people in the Western world sit in chairs like you instead of sitting on the ground with their legs crossed or crouching as humans evolved to do for so many millennia, right? And so this piriformis muscle, which I don't have the right picture to show you the anatomy, it compresses that sciatic nerve. It pinches that nerve. That sciatic nerve is giving sensory and muscle innervation to the whole lower extremity down there. So it can be quite painful, giving you dysesthesias, and etc. It's also clinically notable because sometimes when you're giving an IM injection, intramuscular injection in the gluteus, whoever's doing it to you better know what they're doing and know how to locate the sciatic nerve in the sciatic notch right near the glute medius, because if you stick the needle in the sciatic nerve and inject into the sciatic nerve, it can be quite problematic. And so that's something to avoid if you're ever getting an IM injection in the glute. They want to make sure to not hit the sciatic nerve. All right, so that was a walk down the spinal column. Let's look in a little bit more detail at what we see here in the tissue of a spinal cross-section. So we have posterior and anterior. Let's talk about the gray matter first. On the posterior side, this is going to be sensory neurons. These nuclei are going to be sensory in nature. And on the anterior, so the deep, is going to be motor neurons. And both of them are broken up into somatic and visceral. Somatic, sensory, returning information from the surface of the skin, your touch receptors, etc. And visceral, afferent, returning autonomic type information. So a visceral would be returning information about your internal organs, etc. And then likewise here, somatic, efferent control is going to be your skeletal muscles, and then the visceral efferents are going to be your autonomics. So things like, the smooth muscle that controls the vasoconstriction or vasodilation, or in the gut, or a whole host, any sort of autonomic, visceral, efferent innervation. There are these commissures that you see, the posterior and anterior gray, and then the anterior white commissure. These points I point out because this is where we have decussation. Humans, in fact, most of, is that true, most of life on Earth? Probably not, considering prokaryotes, but most of eukaryotic life on Earth, certainly all chordate life on Earth, is biradially symmetric. So your nervous system so there's this biradial reflection, okay? And your nervous system, there's really two halves to your nervous system. Has anyone heard of the guy Oliver Sacks, sort of that famous neurologist that wrote all those New York Times style books, popular books about neurology, like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat? They're kind of fun reads if you're interested in neurology and how the brain works. Very, very accessible. But he talks about a lesion in the brain in the the corpus callosum, where there's the same sort of decussation, is what I'm getting at here, in the brain, where this person could not recognize the left side of their body. They didn't see the left side of their body as being part of them at all. Like their left hand, they didn't recognize it. It wasn't part of them. What happens, cell bodies on the left that are controlling things that happen on the right, fibers are going to decussate or cross from left to right through these commissures in the spinal cord. All right. We notice here there is this dorsal root ganglion that I pointed to earlier. This is where we're going to have sensory fiber synapse. There's going to be synapses of sensory fibers. When we get to talk, hopefully today, I mean to do it today, we talk about primary and secondary, or first order and second order sensory neurons. That synapse is going to be happening right there. And so we'll see what that means in a moment. Is there anything else I want to point out? So we have these anterior, lateral, and posterior white columns, which are named after the posterior, lateral, and anterior gray horns in the gray matter. And so there's the basic anatomy of the spinal cord, and we're going to talk about a little bit of its functionality in a moment. All right, so then moving on to the white matter, and we talked about the gray matter. The white matter is not arranged in terms of nuclei, it's arranged in terms of tracts, because white matter is myelinated axon. It means signal is going up or down the spinal column. So we think of them as tracts rather than nuclei or centers of cell bodies. All right. There are ascending tracts and descending tracts. So an ascending tract is going to be bringing afferent information upstairs somewhere, and descending tracts are going to be bringing efferent signals downstairs. All right. I talked about decussation already through the commissures, and then basically there's these two other directional terminology that you're going to need. The notion of contralateral. Something that's contralateral is on the opposite side of the body. It's a relational term, a relative term. So my left ear is contralateral to my right eye. All right? Ipsilateral simply means on the same side of the body. My right eye, which eye is that? Here we go. My right eye is ipsilateral to my right ear. Very easy, very easy. Okay? That's all. This is all just basic definitions. There's a lot of words on there, but they're just very basic definitions here. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these spinal tracts. If you want to know much more, you can take a neuroanatomy class in medical school, or you will take a neuroanatomy class in medical school. Okay. Sensory pathways. We're not going to talk about specific sensory pathways here at all, but we will talk about general features that they have. Okay? So a sensory pathway is made up of 3 components. And I mention this because motor pathways are made up of 2 components. So there's this distinction. Sensory pathways have first, second, and third order neurons. A first order neuron is going to have its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, this is all at the beginning. Remember 2 days ago or whatever, I showed the very general schematic, the afferent sensory going upstairs to the brain, and then the motor output coming back down. So we're at the beginning of that cycle here, looking at what happens we have some sort of sensory neuron that, I don't know, it's a touch receptor somewhere in your hands. The cell body is here in the dorsal root ganglion. It comes up and it's going to synapse on the cell body of a second order neuron in the dorsal nuclei, a dorsal sensory nuclei of the spinal cord. All right? This second order neuron can do a number of things. It could be part of a short reflex loop and just send an efferent signal back down to the muscles, which I'm not depicting here. And it can send a fiber up the spinal cord through the lateral spinal thalamic tract, the name of which is not super important to you, to synapse on the third order neuron, which is in the thalamus. If you are going to sensate, like register, consciously register that sensation, if you're going to consciously register the sensation, that synapse is important. Because that third order neuron then projects up into the cerebral cortex and registers on your consciousness. Okay? So first order neuron is actually the sensory neuron with the neuronal body in the dorsal root ganglion. Second order neuron has the cell body in the sensory nuclei of the posterior gray horn. Ascends, synapses in the thalamus on the cell body of the third order neuron, which then projects into the cortex. Okay, sensory pathways. So let me introduce you to Wilder Penfield. I love this guy. He by all accounts, and I certainly never got to meet him. He was gone long before I was on the scene. But by all accounts, he was a lovely man that was from Canada, and he studied. He studied at Princeton. Here he is playing football, and went to Oxford to study with William Osler and Harvey Cushing in New York afterwards. So that means nothing to you, I know, but that is as pedigreed as you can possibly be for his generation. Osler and Cushing were two of the very brightest lights in medicine at the time. And then in McGill, he came up with this concept of the homunculus. Wilder Penfield was a neurosurgeon that would do brain surgery on these people. He would do a calvarectomy. He would take the top off the person's skull. Often these people were awake. They were awake. They had local anesthetic around the point of incision, but your brain actually does not have any nerve sensory. Ironically, it does not have any sensory pain fibers in it, so the brain itself doesn't feel pain. Although it is the only organ that actually registers pain that you're feeling elsewhere. So he would have these people with the top cut off their head, and he started taking electrodes and poking them in parts of the brain. And he'd stimulate a certain region of neurons in the brain, and the person who was awake there would report, I feel tingling in my fingers, or I feel tingling in my toes, or my nose, or my backside, or here, there, and everywhere. And so what he was able to do was delineate that map, that somatotopic map that we have in our brains of all of our sensory receptors across our whole body. Pretty fascinating. He talks about it in this book called Mysteries of the Mind. If you ever have a chance to read it, it is definitely worth your time. It's a pretty short read, and it's deeply engrossing story about this process. So here is his sensory homunculus, a model of his homunculus. And Wow, that looks weird. What is that? Who would like to explain that for me? Okay. Oh, I got someone else. Please. Sorry.
Is it that there are a lot of senses in like the bigger parts of the hands and lips?
Right. So go back to my first lecture. You're right. Go back to my first lecture when I was talking about receptive fields, receptive field size. You remember that? What did I say? I said that receptive field size is inversely proportional to neuronal density. Right? So the more neurons packed into the area, the smaller the receptive field. But consequently, the larger amount of brain that's going to be dedicated to that high density area. So lips, tongue, hands, a little bit in the feet, not too much. We have a high density of neurons in those areas because we have high discrimination, small receptive fields. And so it's going to consequently take a proportionately larger portion of the brain. So when we look at this on the brain, here it is in this. So there's this, when you're looking at the brain, there's this central sulcus that you see here. The lines are called sulci, or sulcus, singular, and gyri, or gyrus, singular, are the lumps, all right? And the crevices are the sulcuses, sulci. So here's the central sulcus. Behind the central sulcus, this is all parietal lobe of the brain, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe. Behind, posterior to that central sulcus, is the postcentral gyrus. This is the primary somatosensory cortex. There is truly this little homunculus, this creature that you saw there, is mapped out the way you see it depicted in this transect of the brain up here. So you stick a needle in where? Right around here somewhere, and ooh, you think you're being kissed. Hands are right behind that here. Relative proportional area to the density of the sensory receptor. So the area of the postcentral somatosensory cortex is proportional to the density of the sensory receptor in the affected or the innervated tissue. Yeah?
If he's cutting the tops of their heads off, I don't know, like how far down is he going? Because that's like, pretty far down on the. Is this
Read the book, brother. It's in there. Okay, so if we're going to have this arrangement for the sensory neurons, might as well use what works for the motor neurons. Same thing. On the precentral gyrus, on the other side of this, directly adjacent, is this primary motor cortex, and it has a motor homunculus, which also has this proportionality, this relationship. So the area of the primary motor cortex is directly related to the density of motor units that are controlling a certain part of the body. So, for example, we have a huge amount of real estate dedicated to the hands because there's a very high density of motor units here. It doesn't mean there's a lot of muscle mass. No, there's a lot of muscle mass in your leg. But here, in your hand, there's a more one-to-one correlation between muscle fiber and motor neuron. Whereas in your leg, a single motor neuron can be controlling a vastly larger array of muscle fibers because we don't need the fine motor control that we need in the hand. You guys understand that? All right, so here is the primary motor cortex. This is the perfect way around the corner down into efferent innervation, efferent outflow. So the somatic motor pathways have at least two motor neurons. These are divided into upper and lower motor neurons. Upper motor neurons, all of this stuff is general somatic efferents that we're talking about here. An upper motor neuron is going to synapse on a lower motor neuron, but it can either facilitate or it may, in fact, inhibit. Depends on the pathway. It may inhibit a lower motor neuron. A lower motor neuron is going to have its cell body either in some somatic motor nuclei of the brainstem, if it's traveling out through a cranial nerve, all right? It can come out through a cranial nerve. If so, its motor nuclei is in the brainstem somewhere. Or it can come out through a spinal nerve. And if that's the case, its motor nuclei is somewhere in the anterior motor nuclei of the gray horns, the anterior gray horn. Does that make sense? You'll notice here, what's interesting, there is no decussation here through the cranial nerve pathway. There's no decussation. And there is decussation through the spinal nerves. This is important. This is important because this can tell you when you have somebody, this gives you what's called upper motor neuron versus lower motor neuron syndromes when a person has a lesion, say a stroke or something like that, or a tumor. You can present with upper motor neuron versus lower motor neuron symptoms. And this depends upon whether you have contralateral presentation or ipsilateral presentation. All right? I'm not going to get into that too much further, but I just wanted you to hear those terms. This is, I talked about the analogies between connective tissue in muscle, the epimysium, the paramysium, and the endomysium, and the similarity to the connective tissue in nerves, in these peripheral nerves. So here's a cross-section of a peripheral nerve. We're going to have this covering over the peripheral nerve called epineurium. Then there's going to be perineurium, which is going to be the conduit for most of the arterioles and venules that are running throughout the body of a nerve. The nerve itself is broken up into fascicles. So here are some fascicles. This is a TEM image of a cut nerve. These are the different fascicles. And then within a fascicle, you'll see individual neurons that are myelinated and surrounded by endoneurium. Endoneurium, an endoneurial covering of the neurolemma, which is the outer layer of the myelinated axon. And we see here, so this is some myelin, a myelin sheath around this axon. There's an axonal cord. And then in between here is all the endoneurium. Yeah, Jacob. Oops, jeez.
And you only see those layers in the peripheral nervous system, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are in spinal nerves.
Okay.
Yep.
And so the spinal cord doesn't follow this trend.
No. It doesn't look like this. Okay. All right. So I want to get through the concept of dermatome here. So we talked about the different nerve plexuses, the cervical, brachial, lumbar, sacral, and there is a bit of a coccygeal plexus. So I won't go into those. But what's interesting here is that these plexuses distribute their fibers in such a way that the sensory innervation of your body, the somatic sensory, the GSA fibers, are distributed across the body in this pattern, this dermatomal pattern. So, for example, the T10 spinal nerve segment is going to innervate this band that wraps around onto the back here in this sort of pattern. So our whole body is is striated in this fashion. We have these stripes of neuronal sensory information that is depicted across the body. This is important. Clinically because of shingles. Has anybody had shingles? I have. It's not fun. Shingles is due to the herpes virus, varicella. 98% of us, so the majority, probably everybody in this classroom, has come into contact with this virus, has it in their body somewhere. It evades the host immune system by localizing to the cell body of neurons, to the soma of neurons, which are immune privileged. Your nerve cells are immune privileged for which we're not going to get into. But when you're having an outbreak, the cell bodies in that particular segment of the spinal cord segment have a breakout, and they produce all these virions, and you get these eruptions in a very typical pattern along a dermatome. All right, so it's on one side along a dermatomal pattern that you're going to see this shingles. All right, it's a herpes zoster. It's the same virus that causes chickenpox. So that's all. The last slide I was going to talk about is referred pain, and yeah, I'll take 10 seconds just to let you know what it is. So the visceral afferent information from the organs on the inside of the body. Oftentimes, we have no point of reference for those organs, so they synapse and onto collaterals that map the surface of the body in different ways. And this is referred pain. So, for example, if you have, everybody knows about heart pain, the left arm. You get this pain across the chest down into the left arm. This is when you have GVA fibers from the heart, general visceral afferent fibers from the heart, refer onto the somatotopic map that covers that part of the body. The appendix is here, small intestine is there. Liver can refer up to your shoulder. All right, so just so that you understand that's how the GVA fibers work. That's it. That was all. I went a minute over.